In this video, we're going to create an enemy for our 2D game that can kill the player, but can also be killed by the player. In the previous videos, we created our level, we created our character that can move left and right. So let's get started here. For my enemy, I'm going to add a new cube. I'm going to press Shift A, M, C to get my cube. I'll press GZ to drag it up. Press GX. I'm going to drag it close to my player to get started with. See, that's on camera. I'm going to shrink my cube down to match my player. So this is going to depend on how big your assets are. I've resized my player to 2 meters tall, which is about the size of a really tall human. So I'm going to press scale 0.5 to cut my enemy in half. I'm going to apply an enemy texture to it. I believe I've already created one. Yes. I go into shading, or textures and shading. That's what my enemy looks like so far. Alright. I'm going to give my enemy some physics. I'm going to click on the little physics tab right over here. I'm going to do dynamic physics. And for good measure, I'm going to lock translation on the y-axis, which is in and out of my level, just to prevent my enemy from falling off the side by accident. I'm going to add some logic here. I'm going to name my enemy. I'm going to call him enemy. I'm actually going to add the enemy to its own collection. So the way I do that is I right click, I can right click on scene collection and say new collection. Gives me a little folder down here. I'm going to call this enemy. I'm actually going to move my enemy model into here. And what this is going to let me do is it's going to let me create multiple enemies, all with the same properties and looks and logic in my level. But this is going to be the master enemy. So if I make changes to this enemy, it will change all the enemies in the level. I want my enemy to start moving. So I'm going to add an always sensor and just have him start moving forward. I'm going to call this forward. Forward for my enemy is going to be in the positive X direction towards Mario. I think I played around with this and did like 0.05. Link that up. I'm going to press numpad to get out of this. I have snap to face turned on. So if I press GZ, I can drag this down and snap it to the face of my level. Alright. So if I press P for play, my enemy starts moving towards the player. Player doesn't have a name. So at any rate, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some hitboxes for my enemy. I want to make it so if my player touches the bottom half of my enemy, the player dies. And then if the player touches the top half of the enemy, then that part will kill the enemy. So I'm going to make 2 hitboxes. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to make sure I'm on the y-axis. And I'm going to move my 3D cursor over here. This is going to allow me to create new objects at the 3D cursor. The reason I made sure I was on the y-axis when I moved the 3D cursor is to make sure that my 3D cursor stayed aligned where it was on the y-axis. So if I'm on the y-axis and I move it, then the 3D cursor will only move along the z and x-axis, and it won't move along the y-axis. So I'm going to add a mesh cube, and I'm going to make it half the height of my enemy. So the first thing I'm going to do is scale this, and say 0.5, which is going to make it the same size as the enemy. And now I'm going to scale it along the z-axis. So scale z 0.5 again. I'm going to rotate my view here. I'm going to GZ to drag it down to the ground, which is going to put it on the same level as my enemy. And I'm going to GX to drag it along the x-axis. Grab X. And that'll perfectly line up my cube, my hitbox, with my enemy. I'm going to call this enemy bottom. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to create a texture called death. And this death texture, I'm going to program on my player, or I already previously programmed it, but I'll show you how to program this, so that any object which the player touches, which has death, will kill the player. I'm going to go to physics for the enemy bottom. I'm going to make it a ghost. I'm going to make it invisible so we don't see it. And for added measure, for when we're doing some modeling here, we can actually go also to the object properties and expand viewport display, and I can change this to a wire. So just a wireframe shows up. And that's a matter of preference. That doesn't matter. That doesn't affect how it'll show up in the game. It'll still be invisible in the game, but I think this looks a little bit cleaner when I'm doing my design. So I'm gonna, over here, select my enemy bottom, and I'm gonna control click my enemy. So I have both of them selected, and my enemy is highlighted orange. That's gonna allow me to parent my enemy bottom to my enemy. So the enemy has its body, which is a cube. I can even rename it as enemy body if I wanted to. And then we have our enemy bottom. All right. So what does this logic look like on the player? So on the player, basically, I just have a collision with death. If I have a collision with death, then I set the property is alive to false, set dead. And that's all this does. If I collide with death, then it sets dead. And then the other property is dead will take care of what happens when the player dies. So in this case, we're just restarting the scene and reviving the player. And actually, we don't even need this because when we restart the scene, it automatically revives the player. And I have the same property set on my water, my environmental hazard over here. This is the hitbox for my water. This is death. If the player touches this, the player dies, starts the death sequence. All right. So, numpad 0, get back in the camera view. Let's try this out, see if this works. Oh, we died. All right. Boom. 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 All right, cool. So that takes care of death. So I'm going to add a new cube. Add mesh cube. So Shift A, MC. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to scale it to the same size as my enemy. So scale 0.5. And then I'm going to scale it to half the height. Scale Z 0.5. I'm going to scale it to half the width as well. Scale X 0.5. I get a nice little oblong thing. Now I'm going to put this in the middle of the top of my enemy. And the reason for this is to prevent the death and the kill hitboxes from hitting a player at the same time. If you have the death and kill hitboxes lined up here, the player will simultaneously die and kill the enemy at the same time, which is fine, but it just looks a little bit weird. So I'm going to, I want to snap this to the top, so I need to move it down. I'll move it to the ground and I'll press GZ again to snap it to the top. Alright, so now I want to line this up with the middle of this face. So there's a couple ways to do this. I guess what I should have done first is, before I resized it, moved it, and then snapped it. So for example, if I scale this along the X direction again and resize it back to the same size as the enemy, then if I grab X and move it, nope, not that way. Here, grab X. I can line it up there, so that's taking up the whole top half of the enemy, and then I can shrink it down along the X-axis again. So if I hide my enemy body, this is what this looks like. I'm going to do the same thing I did to the bottom hitbox. I'm going to go to Physics and change this into an invisible ghost. And then I'm going to go to Object Properties and change Display As to Wireframe. I'll call this Enemy Top. Let's show my enemy again. I can control click my enemy so that my enemy is in orange and my enemy top is in red. I go Object, Parent, Object again. So that's all in there. I can select my enemy top here, and I'm going to give this a new property. A new material. I'm going to call this one Kill. I can use this for different enemies. Maybe I want to be able to kill enemies by jumping on top of them. So I can have a common texture that will all do the same thing. So in this case, for enemy top, I'm going to say, okay, if I have a collision with the player, add an AND controller, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select the enemy. So I shift click the enemy, and I have both the enemy and the enemy top selected. So if I collide with the player, I'm going to kill the enemy, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make the enemy invisible. So I'm going to add a visibility actuator under enemy, call this hide, and I'm going to link from my enemy top controller up to my enemy actuator. So this is going across two objects here. And then I'm going to add a motion here, which I'm going to call shove, which I'm going to shove this enemy off the edge of the level. So I'm going to give it a location of +10. Or I can do -10 if I want to shove it backwards. Now I could use edit property, edit object, and delete the object, but that sometimes has some weird functionality when respawning the user. So it doesn't always work correctly, so it's kind of just easier just to shove them off the edge. Now, the other thing I'm going to do, just for good measure, is I'm going to select the enemy top and the enemy bottom, make sure they're all selected. I'm going to hide the enemy top. I'm going to set the visibility to hide. I'm going to hide the enemy bottom as well, because sometimes there is I think it's a bug, when you create multiple instances of your player where the hitboxes will show up when they shouldn't show up. So if we just go ahead and hide them all, that should take care of that. All right. Let's go into player. I run into side, I die. I jump on my enemy dies. Sweet. So, what do I want to do with my player? I'm going to say, when I collide with kill, when I killed something, and that's going to be a material of kill. I'll add an in controller. What I actually want to do is jump. I want my player to jump, bounce off the top of the enemy. Now the only way this works is if we go to physics and we give our player multiple jumps. So I gave my player 99 jumps. This works out though because I said previously that my player can't jump in midair. My player can only jump if my player is colliding with the ground, is touching the ground. But adding 99 jumps allows me to trigger this jump motion more than once. So I jump on top of the enemy, which uses up my one jump, but then when I hit the top of the enemy, I jump again. Jump, hit, jump, again. Alright, and this concludes the video for creating our enemy. Oh, one more thing. So I can add multiple enemies in here. What I can do is once I have all this in a collection, I can right click on this and say instance to scene. And I kind of popped my enemy off here to the side, but I can drag this enemy independently, so GX. And for some reason, the first time you create an instance, it's kind of messed up, so you might have to go to Object, Set Origin, Center Mass Volume to reset that. Like if I select this enemy here, it's already set. You'll see that orange dot here in the center. But when I select this enemy, I had to do like Center and Mass Origin. Origin to Center Mass. So I can add this guy. Maybe I want this guy sitting on the pipe. So GZ. Oh. What I want to do is it's kind of clipping into the pipe a little bit. That's okay. I can just eyeball it. Or I can snap it and then GZ move it up 0.5. That should do it. Alright, and then maybe GX move this guy back. Alright, but he's going to have the same properties as this first enemy. So if I press play, you'll see we have two enemies here. I can die to either one of them. And I can kill both of them. Jump, jump, and go on. If I make changes to the enemy, so if I go back to the first enemy and say, oh, I want just one of these models, or maybe I want to add a head to them. So Shift A, maybe give them a little cylinder head. Rotate that on the x-axis 90 degrees. Scale it down to 0.25. GZ, and you can see the other sphere has already been added on there. Maybe give them a little head. I don't know what that's going to do. Oh, we have to parent it, so I'm going to parent this to my enemy. So I'm going to control click my enemy, go to Object, Parent, Object, and I'm going to make sure my enemy head is a ghost, so it's not colliding with anything. Now you can see both our enemies have little heads on them. Oh. And one of the side effects of that is I need to now hide the head if I kill the enemy. But you get the idea. I'm just going to delete that. Alright, so now that concludes the video. What we did is we created an enemy that we can kill and be killed by the player. And we did that by using two separate hitboxes and creating logic between different objects. And then we added this enemy to its own collection so that we could spawn the enemy and create multiple instances of the enemy. Thanks for watching and happy blending.